Mr. Chairman and committee, my name is Tim Barton. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I'm here to testify in favor of the bill. You're going to hear from a couple attorneys in just a couple minutes, and they will give you an update on the current status of where the lay of the land is constitutionally understanding from the Supreme Court. Just to give a little context for this, in 2022, there was a Coach Kennedy decision. He was the football coach from Bremerton, Washington, that had been fired for kneeling, saying nothing out loud, but the school district determined that it was a religious gesture, and therefore he was not allowed to keep his job. It took nearly 8 years before it got to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court determined that he had been wrongfully terminated, restored the position, but what they acknowledged is the only reason he had been fired is because of the Lemon decision, which was originated back in 1971 from the Lemon v. Kurtzman decision, and they came up with what was known as a Lemon test. And in essence, they said that you can only do something religious if you can prove you're doing it for secular reasons, which is a rather ludicrous test that violates the First Amendment. However, in the 2022 decision, the U.S. Supreme Court identified that not only should Coach Kennedy be restored to his position, but that Lemon was going to be done away with. It's been a bad test from the beginning. Why that matters is because, as we're talking about the Ten Commandments, in 1980, the U.S. Supreme Court had the Stone v. Graham decision, which was the famous Ten Commandment case, where the Supreme Court determined that Ten Commandments could not be displayed in schools any longer. But the reason they determined that was because it violated the Lemon decision, which now no longer exists for constitutional understanding. What's also significant about that is in 2019, there was the American Legion versus the American Human Association case that went before the U.S. Supreme Court, and it dealt with a very large World War I memorial peace cross. At the end of World War I, there was a group of moms that got together, and they raised money, and they erected a cross to honor their sons who had died in World War I. That was done with private funds on private land, but the federal government bought that land. And there was an atheist that came by, and they were offended by there being a cross on government property. So the case went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, and again, arguing from the Lemon decisions was 2019 before the Lemon was overturned. From this argument, they said, well, clearly these moms were religious. They chose a religious symbol, and so they did something religious for religious reasons that violates the Lemon test. And the Supreme Court said, no, let's pause for a second, because if you look at crosses in cemeteries, we've been doing that a long time, and this has always been accepted. They said, so we're going to allow this to stand because if there's a long-standing history and tradition, there should be a presumption of constitutionality. Well, the new test, the new standard from the U.S. Supreme Court is long-standing history and tradition. Why that matters is because when you look at education, these are New England primers. The New England primer was the first textbook printed in English in America, was first printed in 1690. This is a New England primer from 1777. This is one from 1847. There were multiple versions of this. You can imagine as there were reprints, there were some things they added, some things they took out, but one consistent thing that was in every single New England primer, and this was a first grade textbook used from 1690 through the early 1900s. You couldn't go to second grade till you passed first grade, and to pass first grade, you had to pass this textbook. At the end of this textbook, there's more than 100 questions from Westminster Shorter Catechism, and 43 of them are from the Ten Commandments. Just as an example, as a reference to this, question 45 was, what is the first commandment? Question 46, what is required in the first commandment? Question 47, what is forbidden in the first commandment? On it goes, and there's 43 questions dealing with the Ten Commandments. And it wasn't just the New England primer. Noah Webster, very famous for his dictionary, he did a United States history book as well after the dictionary. In his history book, he has several pages dedicated to not just the Ten Commandments, but how Ten Commandments are the basis and structure of moral law. There's also, and by the way, these are all original documents. At WallBuilders, we have more than 100,000 documents from early American history. It's considered the largest private collection, and the vast majority of our things are from the founding era. So really remarkable stuff. This is an original McGuffey's reader. McGuffey's readers were done in the 19th, the number one reader in the 19th and even into the 20th century. And in McGuffey's readers, in the back of McGuffey's readers, he actually prints the Ten Commandments so all the students can see and know the Ten Commandments. The reason I bring this up is this was such a common part of education. Literally from the Pilgrims up until 1980, the Ten Commandments were in public schools in the United States. So if the standard is history and tradition, unquestionably this passes history and tradition. And there were some people that might say, but this violates the separation of church and state, which that's been a misapplied nomer for a long time. The only historic document that uses the phrase separation of church and state is in a private letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote while he's president. The phrase doesn't appear in the Constitution. It's not in the Bill of Rights. It's not in the Declaration. It was in a private letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote to a group of Baptists in Danbury, Connecticut, because they were concerned, as the Baptists, they were a very small denomination at that time. They were afraid that they were going to be pressured out because coming from Europe, there was always state-established churches. In England, they were Anglican. In Germany, they were Lutheran. In Italy, they were Catholic, and on it went. The king would choose the denomination. They were afraid America was going to go that same route. So they wrote to Jefferson and said, we know you care about religious freedom. Can you do something to make sure that we will never lose our freedom? And he wrote a letter back and said that your freedom is protected. The First Amendment erects a wall of separation between church and state to make sure the government can never interfere with your religious practices. To give you even an indication from the Founding Fathers, this is the first Bible printed in English in America. It's known as the Bible of the Revolution. It's also known as the Robert Aiken Bible because he was the printer for Congress that did this. He went to Congress during the Revolution, and the law at the time said that you're not allowed to print Bibles in the English language because the king controlled the market. The king granted official printership only to the printers that he allowed. They only printed King James Bibles, and so we had to import Bibles. But as we were separating from the king, it occurred to Robert Aiken that maybe we don't need to not only do what the king says, maybe we can print our own Bible. He went to Congress, and he had an appeal to Congress. This is the Bible he came out with, but on the front of this Bible, what's so remarkable, when Congress was asked to print a Bible, they said, like many legislative chambers might, well, let's assign a committee. So they assigned a committee to oversee the printing of the Bible. The committee said, well, if we're going to do a Bible, it should be good. Let's choose 2 theologians who know Greek and Hebrew to make sure it's a good translation. So the very top paragraph is the committee assigning the 2 theologians. The next paragraph is from the theologians doing their research. They come back and report to the committee. And then the last paragraph is a report of the committee back to the Congress. And then it goes down. This last paragraph, before it gets into the chapters of the Bible, is from the Congress, and what it says is, the United States and Congress assembled recommend this edition of the Bible to the inhabitants of the United States. Now, this is our Founding Fathers Congress, that not just a Bible, which is relevant, but the 10 Commandments, they recommended every single person have and read the 10 Commandments. The idea that we would say it's inappropriate for students to see the 10 Commandments is incredibly inconsistent historically when it comes to history and tradition. But I'll go even further. We are living in an era where, as adults, we are looking around and perplexed by the lack of morals by so many people in society, where people are struggling to identify what's right and wrong. And in fact, the idea that we look at young people, and one of the highest causes of death among young people is gang violence, where they are killing each other. And yet, some people would have the audacity to say, well, we shouldn't show kids something that might tell them, thou shalt not kill. That might be inappropriate. You can go to jail for violating things from the 10 Commandments, the very 10 Commandments that some people would suggest students shouldn't be able to see. I would encourage you, as you examine this, the standard, constitutionally speaking, is now a history and tradition standard. There is a long-standing history and tradition of the 10 Commandments being used in education, and it wasn't just because there was a promotion of religion. They understood it's a promotion of morality. It shows a moral standard. We don't steal. We don't kill. In fact, even the standard we use in courtrooms, that you shall not bear false witness, that you can't lie under oath, even provisions of our laws today come from the 10 Commandments. I would encourage that we follow the history and tradition and restore those moral standards back to classrooms. And I'd be happy to stand for questions.